Previously on Fighting for Ezekiel.
In a short period of time, it went from being just something of interest, like, is this something that we need to act on? Like, everything else is fine, to now he's not breathing.
911 emergency, require police fire ambulance.
Hi, yes, my son's not breathing.
By Thursday, they were diagnosing Ezekiel with having brain death. Upon receiving the autopsy report, that I became suspicious that they were going to lay charges. The amount of death threats that began flowing in immediately.
Death threats?
Death threats.
To you?
We've had over 300.
Oh my goodness.
You've got an ambulance service that they were made aware of the fact that they didn't have the proper equipment. They were made aware of that for over a year previous to my son's death. The Crown was trying to use our court case as a precedent-setting case wherein parents could be held criminally liable if they didn't vaccinate their children.
Would you label yourselves as anti-vaxxers?
I guess probably the best way to answer is, are we for vaccines? Absolutely not.
And now, part 3 of Fighting for Ezekiel, a Bridge City News exclusive.
Coming up in part 3 today, we're going to hear about missing medical records. Did the Crown withhold any evidence? Were there inconsistencies in the testimony of medical experts? Could it be that improperly equipped ambulances directly contributed to the death of Ezekiel? Medical records show that Ezekiel went without oxygen for about 8 minutes as a result of not having properly sized breathing equipment in the ambulance. One of the attending paramedics testified in court that ambulances did have the correct size apparatus the year before, but equipment had actually been removed because of miscommunication. Paramedics had repeatedly asked for the proper sized equipment to be restocked, but it apparently did not happen. The court heard that within a week after Ezekiel died, the ambulances finally received the correct equipment. Around that time, the government had also made changes in how ambulances were dispatched, switching from local oversight to using just one dispatch center in Calgary for all of southern Alberta. Is it possible that Ezekiel would have survived if dispatchers had called the volunteer manned ambulance from Glenwood instead of the ambulance from Cardston?
Unbeknownst to us at the time, there's an ambulance in Glenwood.
So this is right close to where you were, like...
We're by the time we got on the phone with 911, we're probably 2.5 miles, 3 miles out of Glenwood is where we're at. And we're heading towards Glenwood. And we ended up driving through Glenwood within about 100 meters of where that ambulance is housed.
So ideally, in an ideal world, the dispatch would have said, Glenwood, go meet the Stephans and get this child some help.
Within minutes of him stopping breathing and CPR being commenced, we could have had an ambulance right there. It was on a Tuesday night. That's the night that they do their trainings. It would have been at about the point where they're starting to close up their trainings. I've actually gone and done some trainings with them and been there when they dispatched. So they were likely already in the building that day, ready to go.
We asked a legal expert, criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind, if there's potentially a case here for a lawsuit against Alberta Health Services. Ari, what are your thoughts?
There's two elements to this answer. One, sometimes lawsuits, as unseemly as they are or as greedy for money as they may be, will lead to a positive change that could help people down the road, whether it be in Alberta or throughout the country. What troubles me about lawsuits sometimes is you're trying to say we're bringing this lawsuit to make change, to help people. Well, you don't always have to sue for $8 million. You can actually sue for $1 and an agreement that the ambulance services, the emergency response teams, will have this equipment. So I get uncomfortable with lawsuits, but if it makes the ambulance division of public safety decide to put these things in an ambulance, it's fine. Where the lawsuit to me would have more meat on the bone, to put it very succinctly, is if Alberta EMT said, no, we're not going to do this because maybe it's too expensive or an extra buck or two, then to me a lawsuit has more merit.
The Stephans say that from the time the ambulance crew turned care of Ezekiel over to the Lethbridge Hospital until Stars Air Ambulance flew to Calgary, there's over an hour of time where there was no medical logs for Ezekiel's care. Another discovery was made that after the first trial and the guilty verdict, there were apparently over 100 pages of medical files missing. Paul Arthur talked with both David Stephan and his brother Brad regarding the issue.
My understanding is that the legal team later tried to get the records from the hospital in Lethbridge.
In Lethbridge, he had checked into the hospital and they had taken an x-ray, and then they released him an hour and a half later. And the STARS ambulance team was there on arrival. They all met in Lethbridge, and they still hadn't transported him for an hour and a half, but there was no records other than this x-ray.
So during this time, this entire time he's in Lethbridge at the hospital, there's no record of what treatment was given, how Ezekiel was doing?
No. There was no actual logs of the drugs he was given, of any of the things that took place in Lethbridge. There was no logs of anything. There was no lab reports. We've asked for them repeatedly. And
Now, what kind of response are you getting from Alberta Health Services? Are they saying these logs simply don't exist, or we lost them, or they were destroyed? What are they saying?
well, the last one I got was a letter from, I believe it was Connie Firth at the Lethbridge Regional Hospital, or Chinook Regional Hospital now. And she just said, we don't have them. Documents I can provide you later. And what we had done is we went through the notes of these doctors where they had noted some lab reports, some events that took place, things like that. And we handed them off to them and said, look, find us the corresponding medical documents for these. They don't exist. She said, I can't help you.
And this is missing?
It seems to be scrubbed. And so the second time that we went there, we were pretty adamant about that, saying, you know, there's records because they're being referenced from other medical records, so they must be in existence. And there was nothing.
So to this date, as of this interview, that has not been produced?
That's correct.
I understand, again, this is after the trial when you learned that, oh, hold on a second, it seems like we're missing some evidence here. So I understand you made a FOIP request?
So yeah, there were a number of requests that were made. Initially, we went to Cardston to see if we could get the x-ray. We went to Lethbridge to see if we could get that x-ray. And then we went to Calgary to see if we could get the entire file. And you know, what we found was that there were roughly 137 pages of missing documentation.
And you did get those then from
We got
Alberta
them.
Health Services? Okay.
And that's what this stack represents right here, is the stack of documents that we didn't have.
So this was, you did not have access to this for the first trial?
No.
David's brother Brad also began to notice some inconsistencies in the testimonies of medical experts when compared to the actual medical records.
You've got a lab report here, and what you see is that no growth was found. They had initially thought there was heavy gram-negative bacilli, but then they looked it over before the final report, and what they found was that there was no gram-negative bacilli. It was debris. It was from the cells that were dying off from the hypoxic injury. Well, this was sent to the medical examiner, and within 45 minutes of receiving that report, he gives Wilson Chan with Calgary Laboratory Services, the microbiologist, on the report, a call and says, you need to find the bacteria. Well, they had just received a report that said there was no bacteria, so what's he looking for? He's attempting to negotiate a result. So the response to it is a revised final report where they then say, disregard that. We found some scant negative bacilli. So then what happens is we see this email. And the interesting thing about this email is that it discusses a test that there are no lab reports, there are no protocols, there's nothing to back up. It doesn't exist. They lost them.
They lost the tests.
Apparently, they're all lost. So in trying to find them, what we did is we sent in a request to Calgary Laboratory Services, and again, Wilson Chan. And what we found was that they have no records of any email communications. Well, that email that doesn't exist, according to this letter.
You have it on file here.
I have it on file, and it was a key piece of evidence in the court case. So now you've got a lab report that says there wasn't any bacteria. you've got a call made to them saying you need to find bacteria. And then you've got a revised report saying, okay, there was a little bit of bacteria. And then an email saying that they found it through a non-clinical test that can't be used clinically anyways. And then you have a letter saying
that there were no emails.
There were no emails. I mean, you connect the dots on this one, it's getting a little shady here. So then you've got Dr. Adiegbo, and he's saying something interesting in his testimony. He's saying that there was growth, that they actually were able to culture gram-negative bacilli. Well, that's kind of interesting because in these lab reports, they all say the same thing. No growth after 4 days, final report. Even the revised lab report says no growth after 4 days. When Dr. Adiegbo was questioned as to why he didn't include in the report the hypoxic event from the ambulance, let me read it to you. It's not about memory. He didn't forget that the ambulance issue happened. It's about me only trying to write positive things. That's my style at the time. So, in essence, what he was doing here was he was admitting on the stand that he was leaving out pertinent information from the autopsy report because he was only writing positive things. Well, positive things for who?
There was much courtroom debate between lawyers and medical experts on the autopsy report and the cause of death. Our team did invite medical experts testifying for the Crown and their legal team to take part in the series, but they either declined or did not return our calls and emails. The medical expert for the defense, forensic pathologist Dr. Annie Savageau, also declined an interview. However, she did testify in court that in her opinion, there was in fact viral meningitis present. She said it was not the cause of death, rather it was a medical misadventure.
Her report would have went as such if she was the one that was doing it, that he died because of medical misadventure.
So it was essentially the trip in the ambulance without the proper equipment that was the cause of death. Now that is not, I would guess, a message that Alberta Health Services wants to hear, because that potentially puts them as being liable for the death of your son.
There's a major interest in trying to cover up medical misadventures because it's being exposed. So instead, they come up with the bacterial meningitis, dead upon arrival, nothing that we could do. You guys let him decline so bad that, we're not going to even make mention of it. And had we not been made aware of it because of the local paramedics, we may have never even discovered that our son had gone for over 8 minutes without oxygen in the ambulance, because it would have been like finding a needle in a haystack in the medical files that were supplied to us. They withheld any of the evidence that would go in direct contradiction to what the autopsy report was listed to say.
So with the withheld evidence, is this referring to the x-ray that Dr. Annie Savageau brought up in the trial that apparently you weren't aware of beforehand?
That's right.
And this was not disclosed to the defense, is that correct? This is an x-ray that was taken upon arrival at Cardston, I believe?
That's correct.
It would
and
show totally clear lungs.
Yeah, so Lethbridge and Cardston both did x-rays during transport, and he had clear lungs, no right pleural empyema, and those x-rays were withheld, and we wouldn't have been made aware of them unless Annie Savageau went into the medical examiner's office and discovered that. And the interesting thing is we get the initial set of disclosure, and we thought we had it all. And then during the preliminary trial in 2014, Dr. Adiegbo starts mentioning or referring to certain documents that my lawyer discovered he didn't have. So then he put in another request for the entire medical examiner's file. And we got it, and we thought we had it. We thought we had it in its entirety, but we still didn't have those x-rays. And we don't know what else we didn't have. But Dr. Annie Savageau, when she went in, and she had this information, she had what the autopsy report stated, and she sees an x-ray that's in direct contradiction to one of the causations of death. And she says, "Are you aware that there's this x-ray? Do you have this?" No, we didn't.
Dr. Savageau's testimony clashed head-on with that of the Crown. She says her findings for the cause of death were the 8.5 minutes, again without oxygen, so a hypoxic injury to the brain swelling and so forth for your son Ezekiel. And I understand there was no medical evidence of bacterial meningitis, but there was for viral meningitis, which again is not fatal in and of itself. So how did that play out in the courtroom?
Well, they never came to a determination on it. When all that evidence was brought forward, which it never came out in its entirety, because Dr. Annie Savageau was actually largely muzzled, if you would. For the first time in her career of actually having testified at over 300 trials, for the first time, she was prevented from being able to present all of her facts, all of her discoveries. And so she never
Was there any particular reason given for that?
Yeah, it was the judge had come down with a ruling that she was not qualified to diagnose illnesses, which is interesting because the diagnosis of an illness, the discovering the causation of death is a diagnosis of sorts. So she wasn't able to discuss what likely led up to his death in regard to the illness that he had, because she would fall under what a medical doctor would, because she works with people that have died rather than people that are living.
So we have a conflict in the courtroom with differing opinions from medical experts for the Crown and the defense. It seems like a difficult task to get consensus on the actual cause of death. We invited Dr. Tina Tan to share her opinion on some of these questions. She's a professor of pediatrics at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University and infectious disease physician at Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. Dr. Tan, are you able to comment on the x-rays taken of Ezekiel? Does the medical evidence point conclusively to right pleural empyema and bacterial meningitis as the cause of death? Or could it just as easily have been caused by hypoxic injury?
So if you look at his x-rays, he definitely does have a fluid collection on the right side of his x-rays. Now, you're not going to know whether or not it's empyema at the time you see the x-ray until somebody either taps it, or unfortunately in this case, they did the autopsy and it did show that he had an empyema on the right side of his lung. But I don't think that's what resulted in his death. If you look at the autopsy, and this is just based on autopsy material, when you look at his brain, he really does have a layer of purulent material that covers the surface of his brain. And this is much more commonly seen in bacterial meningitis, not in viral meningitis. Now, I do understand that they didn't send off cultures, or cultures were sent, but they weren't sent off properly. But when you see a coating of pus on top of someone's brain, that really does point much more toward bacterial meningitis.
And the clear x-rays that were taken on the initial arrival, does that mean one thing one way or the other?
It really doesn't. I mean, he can have a collection of fluid that may not be seen initially, and then on subsequent x-rays you can see the collection of fluid, which he did have on some of those x-rays.
Coming up, we will hear more from pediatric specialist Dr. Tan as to what the cause of death likely was. We will also hear from Toronto criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind, weighing in on how the courts handle cases in which medical experts differ in their opinions on the cause of death. Join us for part 4 tomorrow.
Next time on Fighting for Ezekiel.
Well, one of the dangers, and this has been something that's talked about by a lot of defense lawyers throughout the years, is where judges pretend to be doctors.
Did Ezekiel die from a lack of oxygen to the brain, or was it bacterial meningitis?
And I think a lot of his distress was secondary to the fact that he did have a meningitis.
With contradictions in the courtroom, we'll learn what qualifies as perjury and what doesn't.
Perjury happens all the time in courts throughout Canada, and it's extraordinarily unfortunate that crowns are so gun-shy, or I say actually gutless, to charge people for it.
Find out what happens in our courtrooms. This and more in part 4 of Fighting for Ezekiel.